Good afternoon, sir. This is Group 10, Ethics of Sex by me, Marvin Andrew T. Sabado. So, ethics of sex, sexual ethics, also known as sex ethics or sexual morality, is a branch of philosophy that considers the ethics or morality or otherwise in sexual behavior. Sexual ethics seeks to understand, evaluate, and critique interpersonal relationships and sexual activities from a social, cultural, and philosophical perspective. We have here premarital sex, adultery, LGBTQ and homosexuality, same-sex marriage, prostitution, and pornography. I did some little research on all of this, but we will more focus on same-sex marriage and premarital sex. So we will start with the premarital sex. Premarital intercourse is morally acceptable, but they have a high fear of pregnancy. More security is desirable than exists in their present relationships. At least at that point in relationship, development and commitment of some sort and love are important to them. Given the importance of sex in our lives, it is understandable that sexually, morality is a topic of universal concern. Since sex is connected with the bringing of children into the world, it is inevitable that sexual behavior, however private and intimate in itself, must be a concern of our social morality, as well as of our own private moralities. There are many people, however, who believe that as long as children are not involved, private, consenting adult sexual behavior such should be beyond the scope of legal prohibition or moral criticism. As they see it, while individuals can rightfully be condemned for such things as dishonesty, selfishness, and exploitiveness that accompanies their sexual behavior, they cannot rightfully be condemned for sexual behavior alone. However repulsive or unnatural it appears to the majority underlying the views of such individual, one will find a strong commitment either to hedonistic, utilitarian, or libertarian principles, secular, util, utilitarians focusing upon the consequences of different sexual practice are considerably less apt to accept rigid moral principles in this area than those who derive their sexual morality from religious tradition. Aware that the science of anthropology testifies to large variations in patterns of sexual behavior in different cultures, such individuals are apt to tolerant divergent sexual lifestyles. Their conservative opponents, on the other hand, will considerably less tolerant. From their perspective, certain deviant sexual practices threaten the very fabric of our collective way of life. Such individuals will discard the anthropological findings of diverse sexual practices are morally irrelevant. Most who accept this perspective, who will appeal to some view of natural law or divine relation as the source of their moral condemnation of certain sexual practices. However, not all moral conservatives on sexual matters base their view on the belief that there is a single correct sexual morality which derives its ultimate justification from the natural law or from revealed word of God. As we shall see in this chapter, there are moralists who attempt to justify a conservative attitude toward sexual morality on the basis of a utilitarian concern for the maximization of human happiness. As they see it, certain conventions, however, arbitrary as to proper sexual behavior are necessary to maintain the cohesiveness that is essential from social living and in turn for human happiness. The first part of this handout will be devoted to critical discussions of the morality of non-marital sex, homosexuality, contraception, and artificial reproduction, since the burden of moral persuasion should be on those who have us interfere with our morally condemn others for their behavior. Our primary concern will be the arguments that have offered a restrictive conservative attitude toward sexual morality. As we shall see, these arguments tend to collapse on carefully analysis. Nevertheless, specific permissive liberal attitudes towards sex, as exemplified, for example, by the Playboy philosophy, are equally incapable of proof. To open marriages and freedom from sexual guilt that sexual liberals often advocate have their benefits, no doubt, but they are also their price. In particular, the permissive view of the virtual of sex without marriage that flourished in the late 60s through in the mid 80s has recently been overshadowed by the ominous threat of AIDS as the specter of death hovers menacingly as a price of for non-monogamous sex. Casual sex has lost much of its appeal. Caution. Now it's the now is the smart word in sexual declines as the flower childrens of the 60s found themselves approaching middle age and often discovering the sexual freedom they once loudly heralded as a sign of their emancipation was nothing but a detour on the road to long-range happiness. Inundated by nudity and graphic sexuality in the various mediums of communication, many of us look back wistfully to the day when sex was linked more strongly with romance and sexual activity was imaginatively suggested rather than graphically displayed. The freedom from the guilt that so animated the sexual revolution of the late 60s, it was widely discovered could leave one emotionally impoverishment and drift. Yet, while sex alone cannot for most us provide the emotional salvation we seek, we're inundated for by conflicting messages on the relationship of sex and marriage and moral propriety of certain sexual practices. In addition, we find ourselves in the midst of cross currents of conflicting pronouncements as the legitimate limits of the society's right to enforce the predominant and pervasive moral values upon members who reject these values. This issue shall occupy us in the second part of this handout. So that's for the premarital sex. For the other one, we will focus here on same-sex marriage. Whether we get same-sex marriage this year or whether we have to wait longer, one thing is certain: same-sex marriage in Australia is inevitable. And the reason it's inevitable is quite simply because it's the ethical thing to do. A few moments of reflection based on almost any ethical system in the world must inevitably lead to this conclusion. Why? Because it all comes down to this same-sex marriage has no effect on anyone except those same-sex couples who choose to get married. Ultimately, in this simple realization, that explains why laws to allow same-sex marriage are spreading throughout the world. Almost all ethical systems are based on some various of the golden rule. Simply put, this meaning putting yourself in the position of other person to try and to understand how your actions will affect them. Basically, if you wouldn't like people to do what to you, it is unethical for you to do it then. In Christianity, it is often cited as do unto others, do others as you would have them do unto you. So what happens when apply these fundamentals principles to the issue of same-sex marriage? How people both within a same-sex couple and also outside of that couple affected by allowing or preventing the marriage of that couple. Marriage in our society carries enormous social and legal significance. So if you were a member of a same-sex couple who wanted to get married but were denied that right, you would suffer real detriment. Many of your family members, friends are getting married, but you are prevented by the law from marrying that person you love. You would most likely feel distress, anxiety, and frustration. The Ethics of Same-Sex Marriage by Tony Pittman was launched on March 2012. Tony Pittman is a Melbourne-based LGBT rights activist and broadcaster at radio station Joy 94.9. He's a former Lionel Murphy scholar and is about to begin the PhD at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. Whether we get same-sex marriage, this ethical thing to do, a few moments of reflection based on almost ethical system in the world most inevitably lead to this conclusion. Why? Because it all comes down to the same-sex marriage has no effect anyone except those same-sex marriage who choose to get married. Ultimately, it is simple realization that explains why law allows the same-sex marriage are spreading throughout the world. So on and on. So this is my reporting, sir, for Group 10 Group 10 Ethics of Sex. Thank you, sir. God bless.